Welcome, everyone. It is 6 p.m. on the dot, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks so much for joining in. My name is Avery Davis Lamb. I'm the Climate Resilience Coordinator at Creation Justice Ministries, and I want to welcome you to Policy Solutions for Climate Resilience. This workshop is part of a series of climate resilience workshops that we're hosting through Creation Justice Ministries. And through this series, we're presenting the question, how can our churches be hubs of climate resilience in our communities, helping our neighbors weather the physical and the spiritual storms of the climate crisis? In our previous sessions, we've asked questions around building physical resilience, deepening democracy, and addressing the trauma of the climate crisis. Today, we have a spectacular lineup of experts on policy who will light the path before us as we look forward to possibilities of climate resilience into 2021. I'll introduce each of our experts separately, but here's the path laid before us for today. We'll start with an opening prayer from Amy Reumann. Then we'll move on to a view from Congress from Congressman Donald McEachin. Then we'll hear from Mark Rupp about advocacy opportunities. And we'll close out with some further resources from myself. Just a few words of housekeeping before I move on. The first is please keep yourself on mute throughout the program. If you'd like to engage, please engage using the chat box. And that includes posting questions. We will have two opportunities for Q&A throughout the program. Once after Representative McEachin, and then after Mark. Annika, who is running tech, will collect those along the way. So please post those whenever the questions occur to you. Finally, this program will be recorded and sent out to all registrants. So please stay on throughout the entire program if you're possible so you can engage in person. But if you'd like to come back and visit the recording or share it with any of your friends afterwards, the recording will be posted on YouTube and shared out in an email next week. So I'm going to stop sharing my slide here and introduce our first presenter. So Amy Reumann serves the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America as a Senior Director for Witnessing in Society. She's based in Washington, D.C., leading federal public policy advocacy, a network of 18 state public policy offices, United Nations Advocacy, and the Corporate Social Responsibility Program. She is an ELCA pastor who has served congregations in urban, rural, and suburban settings in New Jersey and Wisconsin. She previously led Lutheran Advocacy Ministry in Pennsylvania and an ELCA state public policy office. Amy is a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Muhlenberg College with a major in religion and international affairs, and she earned her Master of Divinity from the Lutheran School of Theology in Chicago. She also has a study at the Theologisches, I think I pronounced that right. We'll see if she can correct me there, seminar in Leipzig, Germany. Leipzig, German Democratic Republic. She holds a Master of Sacred Theology degree in Christian Spirituality and Spiritual Direction from the General Theological Seminary in New York City. She also serves on the boards of Bread for the World and Jubilee Network USA. She was a Green Faith Fellow in Religious Environmental Leadership and a founding board member of Pennsylvania Interfaith Power and Light. Amy is also a master gardener, and she enjoys educating others about native plants and sustainable agriculture, and she volunteers in local urban agriculture and food security efforts. She enjoys a good mystery, quilting, long hikes, and her 2 daughters and 2 cats. With that introduction, Amy, I will hand it over to you. Welcome.
Thanks, Avery, and that's an awful lot about me. I thank you for the opportunity to be here as we stand, poised at the beginning of a new Congress and a new administration. This is a wonderful time to gather around our commitments around climate as people of faith. And so I appreciate the opportunity to do some reflecting with you together tonight. As I think about resilience as a theme for our goal in climate work, as well as a gift that we have as people of faith, I want to focus tonight and center us around the 46th Psalm. This psalm has been on my mind for some time. particularly during the storming of the Capitol. It was reported afterwards how the new House chaplain went to the 46th Psalm to read that and its words of comfort and God's presence at hope during that time for those who were there in the chamber. And it's something that many who said afterwards that they reached to as they watched in horror from the outside. It's a psalm that speaks to us about the resilience of God and the resilience of human beings who are in community with God through using images of the natural world to describe that the tumult of life is real, but so is the bedrock of God's love and faithfulness. Because there's lots of words in our lives right now, I want to invite us into a few images as we read the psalm together. So ask a moment patience as I share my screen. So please center yourself as I read the psalm to you. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth should change, though the mountains shake in the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble with its tumult. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High. God is in the midst of the city, it shall not be moved. God will help it when the morning dawns. The nations are in an uproar, the kingdoms totter. He utters his voice, the earth melts. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. Come, behold the works of the Lord. See what desolations God has brought on the earth. Who makes wars cease to the end of the earth? Who breaks the bow and shatters the spear? Who burns the shields with fire? Be still and know that I am God. I am exalted among the nations. I am exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. Psalm 46, it starts with this amazing image of the earth and the seas in an uproar. Water that is always a sign of chaos is foaming and roaring. The earth is shaking so that even the foundations of the mountains are moving. Nature is broken. It's been turned into a destructive and death-dealing force, rebelling against the Creator. Interesting, the word uproar is also the same Hebrew verb used for what's happening in the nations. So accordingly, as nature is in revolt, the nations are also in an uproar. And so that the well-being of everything, the entire creation, and all of human society and its future are in doubt. What Psalm 46 answers and asks and answers for us is, where is God when everything is in ferment? And it gives us the answer in many images, but one that I want to lift up, which is refuge. That God is a refuge, a strong and unshakable presence in such times. It's one small word, but it's the large concept in Scripture. Refuge is used to describe our need for safety, any kind of sanctuary, any place where protection is offered. Refuge is also a word that speaks to us of the promises of God, and that God will offer such a space for us, and that our response to God's refuge throughout Scripture is always one of trust and confidence and reliance in the one who will keep us safe, even when the nations and all of the world is in an uproar. The upshot, or the result of God offering us refuge, is not just this relationship of trust, but also that we will not fear, which is what the psalmist says. The fear is real, but just as real as God's power and that presence and that promise. So tonight we're talking about climate resilience, but we can't get to a resilient climate without resilient human beings, right? And while we have a lot of advocacy to do on policy, we have a lot of letters to write and calls to make, and our work cut out for us in the time ahead, there's also a spiritual resilience that we are called to cultivate and to nurture in ourselves and one another, to build community and help to share hope and support one another, and thereby enhancing the resilience of one another as part of our call. The fear is real. We're a long way down the road towards climate destruction and the uproar described here. The storm is here and the mountains are shaking. But to tackle this as a nation and as people of faith, sorry, I got to stop my screen share. But to tackle this as a nation and as people of faith, our faith is stronger than that fear. And what Psalm 46 reminds us of is that God's steadfast love and promise to be our refuge gives us a still small space from which to operate, from which to be even in the eye of the hurricane, and to nurture that space with and for one another. Finally, there's a river whose streams make glad the city of God. Well, Jerusalem doesn't have any rivers in it. And so what I wonder if those rivers whose streams make God glad are us, that we are to be that source of flowing love and grace and passion for justice and care for all of the created order, to let that flow through us and increase and encourage our own resilience so that we can face the climate challenges ahead. As we move to prayer, there's so much to pray for tonight as we move into our new future together. But I would actually like to use for a prayer tonight words from yesterday's inaugural poem, Amanda Gordon's The Hill We Climb. The last part of which, well, prayer is poetry, right? And poetry, prayer, that's why we have the Psalms. But the last final verses of it struck me as a prayer for our nation that also speak to the resilience that we help create with and for one another that will give us what we need to build a resilient climate. So I'd ask you to adopt whatever posture you do when you pray and hear these words. And we offer them to God together. We will not march back to what was, but move to what shall be. A country that is bruised but whole, benevolent but bold, fierce and free. We will not be turned around or interrupted by intimidation because we know our inaction and inertia will be the inheritance of the next generation. Our blunders become their burdens. But one thing is certain, if we merge mercy with might and might with right, then love becomes our legacy and change our children's birthright. So let us leave behind a country better than one where we left. With every breath from my bronze-pounded chest, we will raise this wounded world into a wondrous one. We will rise from the gold-limbed hills of the West. We will rise from the windswept Northeast where our forefathers first realized revolution. We will rise from the lake-rimmed cities of the Midwestern states. We will rise from the sun-baked South. We will rebuild, reconcile, and recover in every known nook of our nation. In every corner called our country, our people diverse and beautiful will emerge battered and beautiful. When day comes, we step out of the shade, aflame and unafraid. The new dawn blooms as we free it, for there is always light. If only we're brave enough to see it. If only we're brave enough to be it. And the people of God said, Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Amy. Thank you for your words and for sharing again those beautiful words that so many of us heard earlier this week. With that wonderful grounding, we are going to shift over to our next esteemed guest. I am honored to introduce Congressman Donald McEachin. Congressman McEachin was first elected to represent the 4th Congressional District of Virginia on November 8th, 2016, and since then has been a fierce voice of justice in Congress. Congressman McEachin serves as whip of the Congressional Black Caucus, co-chair of that caucus's Energy, Environment, and Agriculture Task Force, and vice chair of the Sustainable Energy and Environment Coalition. During his first term in Congress, Representative McEachin co-founded the United for Climate and Environmental Justice Congressional Task Force and continues to lead the task force as a co-chair. The other committees he serves on include the House Committee on Energy and Commerce, the House Committee on Natural Resources, and the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. Hidden among his many accomplishments and accolades is a Master of Divinity from Virginia Union Seminary, where he cultivated a love for God's creation and a faithful voice to fight for its liberation. He continues to use that faithful voice in the halls of Congress, and we are blessed to hear from him today. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Congressman McEachin.
Good evening, and thank you for having me. It is so good to be with you. I greet you in the precious and powerful name of our God, however you imagine him or her to be. I thought I would just share some thoughts with you because the most important aspect of my being with you tonight is to really hear and wrestle with the questions that you all have and the suggestions that you all might have. But let me share with you a few thoughts about the climate change movement, the environmental justice movement, however you want to phrase it. First of all, I come to this movement rather recently in terms of my lifespan. I'm 59 years old, just turned 59 last October. And I really was agnostic towards the environment before 2007. In 2007, I was already a member of the Virginia legislature. I was in the House of Delegates and began my run for state senate. A year or so earlier, I had started seminary at Virginia Union University, and we were beginning to engage in conversation about creation care. As the Lord would have it, at the same time, a particular volunteer for my Senate campaign had decided that she had had enough of the incumbent state senator and was going to wanted to help me. And so we walked together, we talked together. She was always in my ear about climate. For her, it was the James River. But the point is that she was always in my ear about climate. And we really began to engage in relationships. She knew my children, I knew her issues. She knew things about me that a lot of people didn't know. We became friends. And I want to suggest to you that the most effective way I think that you all can be the grassroots citizen lobbyists that you are called to be is to engage with a legislator in that fashion, to adopt a legislator, if you will, to get to know him or her and to let them know about your concerns about the environment. It doesn't necessarily need to come, you don't necessarily need to preach to them. What you need to do, in my judgment, respectfully, is to befriend them and make them feel like they're in a safe space, and then they can understand where you're coming from, and who knows where that might end up. With me, it certainly ended up being an advocate for the environment. I had many people who helped me along the way because I had a steep learning curve. I needed that yellow book that says Environment for Dummies. And so I had folks who helped me with that along the way. And they deserve as much credit as anyone on this side of heaven for me being an environmental advocate today. I know that part of what you all want to talk about is sea level rise and the challenges that presents. But I want to expand a little bit as we talk about that to think about environmental justice communities as a whole, because I believe that we are called, whatever our faith tradition might be, to help those who have been disenfranchised, to help those who may not have a voice in the system, and to advocate on their behalf if they're downtrodden. To my Christian brothers and sisters, I refer you to Luke 4, and I think it's 4 and 11, where Jesus comes out of the wilderness and gives his inaugural address and says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me to give good news to the poor." And that good news ought to be that you can breathe clean air. I want to suggest to you that good news ought to be that you can drink clean water. And I want to suggest to you that good news means that you ought to be able to enjoy all the wondrous things there are in this wonderful, precious gift that we call the world. Other traditions have similar sentiments, and I want to I would suggest to you all that you all turn to those as you think about who it is that we are sent to help, who it is that we are sent to minister to. Again, using my faith tradition, of course, which is the one I'm most familiar with, Jesus really was sent to work with what I call the working poor, those folks who were trying to eke out an existence on the plains of Palestine. Well, in a similar vein, we see those same people or those same types of people in Appalachia. We see them in the inner cities of Richmond. We see them in all sorts of EJ communities, whether those communities be Black or brown or indigenous or just flat out poor. Again, folks who are disenfranchised. And so, I've been privileged to offer a bill that's actually been written by EJ communities called Environmental Justice for All. Happy to talk to you about that tonight. But as we think about resiliency, as we think about sea level change, let us not just stop there. Let us expand our thought process to all environmental justice communities, because while they may have different challenges, different solutions, they have a commonality in that they are disenfranchised, some for historic reasons, some for economic reasons, but nonetheless, they are on the outside looking in. I would like to suggest to you that our God asks us to open doors for them, open windows for them, allow them to come into the room, to sit around the table and to participate fully in resolving this issue that we have given climate change. The other thing I find so exciting, and then I'm going to shut up after I say this because this is going to start to get me in trouble. But the other thing I like about the climate change movement, it gives, again, now I'm referring to my own faith tradition, the Christian church, it gives the church an opportunity to reconcile to itself. If you've noticed, we have got radical differences within the Christian church, some of which I would suggest to you make zero sense. But among those is we have a Christian left and a Christian right. Well, one happy place that they can meet, I would suggest to you, is on the environment, because we all agree that through Genesis, that we were put here to be caretakers of this world, that we were given dominion over this earth. Dominion not to run roughshod, but dominion as in the case of the kings of Israel, which was to take charge and to take care of their people. Well, we're to take charge and to take care of this earth that we've been given. And perhaps, just perhaps, we can finally unify the church around the issue of the environment, because we are so splintered about so many other things that perhaps taking care of this planet, this gift again that we call Earth, can be how we reconcile our church one to another. With that, I'm going to be quiet and try to deal with the questions that you all have. And it doesn't matter where they're coming from. I see some tough ones already in the chat. We can tackle those, or we can tackle others. I'm ready, or at least I think I am.
Thanks, Congressman McEachin. Yeah, participants, please continue to send in questions to the chat, and I'll share those with you, Congressman. A first one is just, could you share a little bit more about the details of the Environmental Justice for All Act, particularly how, as faith-based advocates, we can engage in the work to fight for environmental justice through that particular act?
Well, what we've done is Chairman Rahul Grahava, who is the chair of the Natural Resources Committee, was kind enough to ask me to work with him on this issue. And what we did was we said it's time to stop having Washington dictate to folks what their answers ought to be. Let's go see what they think their answers are. And so we engaged for almost a course of time of almost 2 years, talking to environmental justice communities and trying to understand what they think of as their challenges and how we can best serve them. And so when I say that we have had an opportunity to offer their bill, I mean that sincerely. We acted as scriveners. We took their ideas and put them into legislative ease, if you will. There are a couple of key foundational points to the bill. One is that it gives folks an opportunity on their own under the Civil Rights Act to sue for clean air, clean water. They don't have to wait for a white knight. They don't have to wait for a governmental actor like an attorney general to come in and save them. They can go about that process for themselves. It requires government to engage in meaningful conversation under NEPA before they take some regulatory action that will affect that community. And perhaps the single most important point of the bill or aspect of the bill is cumulative effect. Right now, if we put a project into a particular area, we look at that project in a silo almost and say, what's this project going to do to a particular community? If it passes muster, you can go ahead and conduct your business there. What we don't do is look at what else is going on in the community. What other projects have already been there? What other projects are already exposing folks to various pollutants and the like? And so what this does is it says, look, before you put a new project into a particular area, let's see what's going on there to begin with and see if that area is not already overburdened with pollution and uh, um, whether it's bad air, bad water, or what have you. As a concerned environmentalist, you can interact with the bill any way you choose. We'd love to have you come and sit at our environmental justice roundtable and listen and participate. We have those periodically. On the line, I believe with me is my legislative director and my deputy chief of staff. She's one and the same, Corey Solo. We're happy to put our address, contact information in the chat. And if you are so inclined, you can come and find out when the meetings are and participate. But again, I sort of alluded to the best way to affect legislators, whether it's at the state level or the congressional level, and that's to engage with us in some form or fashion so that you have a personal relationship with us and not just one where you're a constituent. If you're a Virginian, and I don't know how many Virginians are on the line, but if you're a Virginian, you know there's an election every year. So you have that opportunity every year, whether it's at the state level or the federal level, to engage in the fashion that I've suggested. But even if you're not a Virginian, if you've not been given that blessing, you do have the opportunity every 2 years to engage with your congressmen or senators, depending on who's on the ballot that year. And I would suggest you do it. You'll be amazingly effective. Not the least of which, one of the most important reasons you'll be effective is because God is with you.
Great, thanks, Congressman McEachin. We have a couple questions in the chat about various carbon fee and carbon pricing setups. Could you just share a few words about your position on carbon pricing and maybe any possibilities for passing a carbon price in the new Congress?
I think we're going to pass something, but it's funny that you, excuse me, raised that issue because we were talking about it today in another format in another meeting, an environmental justice meeting. And what a lot of folks don't realize is that one of the dangers with carbon pricing is that if you don't do it right, and we can do it right, but you have to be aware, if you don't do it right, you are going to put more of a burden on EJ communities. Because anytime you start dealing with the free market system, folks are going to go to where the land is the cheapest, where opportunities cost the least. And those historically have been EJ communities because, and I can go through a litany of reasons, whether it's because historically they've been subject to redlining and therefore prices in their areas have been depressed, or whether it's the history of Hispanics in this country or indigenous peoples, or just again the poor, their land and their property and those areas tend to have already cheaper land prices. And so if you're going to have a carbon pricing system that's going to allow trading or whatever, because there are different ways to go about doing it, if you're not careful, you're going to end up pushing these projects into these already depressed areas. So how are you careful? You are careful by making sure that whatever you do, you take in cumulative effect, would be my suggestion. And so I will be trying to leverage my vote and the votes of others who are similarly situated with me philosophically to suggest that if we're going to go with any of these plans, that we go forward with cumulative effect in mind to make sure that we protect environmental justice communities.
Great, thank you so much, Congressman. We're coming up on the end of your time here. So I'll just ask you to spend your last minute offering any sort of benediction and sending forth that you'd like for the faithful people gathered here.
Oh, well, you're very kind. I would Following Amy is a tough act, but I will just share with you again from my faith tradition the story of Jesus being in the back of the boat, and Jesus is asleep in the back of the boat, and a storm comes, and the disciples are panicked, and they're like, "We're gonna die! We're gonna die! Jesus, help us! Help us! Don't you care? We're gonna die!" And Jesus says, "Oh, ye of little faith!" And the next thing they know, they've crossed through the storm, and they're on the other side. Um, Regardless of our faith traditions, we serve a God who will take us to and take us through. And I have every confidence that although we are just getting to trying to solve the problems of the environment and that the clock is ticking, the God that we serve will take us to the problem and will take us through the problem. And when we come out on the other side, we'll be able to sing hallelujah, thank you, God, because we'll be passing on a better earth than the one we found. May the Lord bless you and keep you all. Thank you for all that you do, but more importantly, thank you for all that you're going to do in the name of our God. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Congressman. It's been a blessing to have you here.
Thank you.
And with that, we will shift over to our next speaker today. I'm pleased to introduce Mark Rupp. Mark Rupp served as Director of State Federal Policy and Affairs at the Environmental Defense Fund, where he works across EDF's ecosystems program, which includes working lands, Western water, and coastal resilience. Mark joined EDF after having served as Deputy Associate Administrator for Intergovernmental Relations at the EPA, where he oversaw state and local relations, state partnerships, and regional operations. Mark is an attorney with a Bachelor of Science degree in Environmental Policy and Assessment, and we are blessed to have him here today. I'll hand it over to you, Mark.
Hey, thank you very much, Avery. And what an incredible group of people. Thank you for coming together on an evening like today. It's nice to see. I hail from Washington State, and so I saw in the chat there are folks from Poulsbo and Tacoma. Always nice to see hometown folks. A little, just a little side note. My mother is retired clergy, United Methodist, and my sister is a minister. And I think growing up, my mom always assumed that I would follow in her footsteps. And she could have been a little disappointed that I chose the law instead, but I really always enjoy meeting with folks from the faith community, so that I can tell my mom I met with you all. So thank you for giving me that opportunity. For those who don't know much about the Environmental Defense Fund, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization with over 2.5 million members worldwide, dedicated to protecting human health and the environment, where we use science, the law, and economics to do that. We've got a lot of programs at EDF. We have a whole climate program. We have an energy program, a health program, and an oceans program. And as Avery mentioned, I work in our ecosystems program, where a lot of EDF's resilience work takes place. So in the face of climate change, there really needs to be significant work on both sides of the climate coin. So it's reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and it's also building up resilience and adaptation. I work in a political environment. I particularly like resilience because it does seem to be the one piece of climate change where you do have bipartisan support. Because unfortunately, climate change as a term of art, unfortunately is seen by many as a partisan issue still. But folks who don't want to talk about climate change actually are seeing and feeling the impacts of climate change across every landscape. And the catastrophes are many and they're varied. Folks will recall that just this past year, we saw a series of deadly wildfires across the West that burned more than 10.5 million acres, larger than the areas of Maryland, Delaware, and the District of Columbia combined. And then there were the record-breaking Atlantic hurricanes that forced us to actually go into the Greek alphabet because we'd already gone through the alphabet in naming those storms. And then also in August, the derecho that sort of swept across the Midwest killed 4 people and caused $7.5 billion in damages. So these events are decidedly compelling if they're happening to you or in your backyard, even more so. And they're really what are driving members of Congress to act, regardless of party, on resilience and really identifying bipartisan approaches. So a little bit of our resilience work. In early 2020, we asked interns to research resilience-themed bills that had been introduced in the 116th Congress. So what shouldn't have been our surprise, but I guess it sort of was, just given the politics of the last several years, there were a lot of bipartisan bills looking at resilience across all sorts of sectors. We wrote some blogs about bipartisan resilience. And at the end of the year, we actually had an op-ed in The Hill, which is a journal that a lot of Hill folks look at. And in that op-ed, we laid out for Congress and the incoming administration a framework of resilience that we are calling Resilience Across America. And I think Annika's going to put in the link to that op-ed if people want to read it at a later date. So we went through all those bills that we identified. We winnowed the list quite a bit and landed on about 30 of them that cross multiple federal agencies and then plugged them into this Resilience Across America framework. And that's another link that Annika can put into the chat for us, where we've got a sort of one-page overview of Resilience Across America, and then a list of the bills by federal agency. Nearly every agency was addressed by Congress. There were some that weren't, and so EDF offers some ideas to Congress. For example, within the Department of Education. So education is not in the business of controlling curricula. That's a state and local decision. But the department does host a website, the Federal Resources for Educational Excellence, where they disseminate educational resources for parents and teachers. And so our suggestion is that the Secretary of Education work with the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, together with the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, to develop or identify educational resources related to environmental justice. Another agency that we did not find a bill related to resilience was the Department of Justice. And so there we suggest that Justice assess the degree to which there are illegal losses that there are losses experienced by victims of natural disasters, where you might have predatory lenders coming after them and promising, full enrichment for their losses, which are not true. And so Justice would develop recommendations for Congress as to how we might reduce those risks. So Resilience Across America is really this opportunity to hold a mirror up to Congress and let members know just how much they've been doing in laying the groundwork for resilience. We saw some of the ideas from the framework actually pass in the final days of the 116th Congress. There's a new state revolving loan fund at FEMA that will be stood up, and that is intended to help states and locals and tribes actually finance investments in risk mitigation projects. That bill passed unanimously out of both chambers, was signed by President Trump, all of which again demonstrates the bipartisan nature of resilience. There was, so folks may have followed the Congress at the end of December needed to pass a funding bill so that the government would be funded through the end of the current fiscal year, which ends on September 30th. And so within that funding bill were a whole lot of things that were added to it at the last minute just to get them passed. There's a big energy bill. There was a Water Resources Development Act, which actually does a lot towards building resilience using natural infrastructure. A couple of the things that we were working on that are included in our Resilience Across America framework, there are some policies and funding to deal with drought conditions in the West, always a challenge given a changing climate. And then there is also a provision for the Department of Energy to create these hybrid microgrids for rural communities that are often exposed to extreme weather events and high energy costs. With the start of the 117th Congress, which just started recently, we are beginning to reach out to members of Congress who sponsored and or co-sponsored a number of the bills within our framework, encouraging them to reintroduce those and see how EDF can help them. To give you a flavor, and you'll have an opportunity if you go to the links that Annika sent around, you'll see more of these, but just to give you sort of a flavor of where we see some congressional focus on resilience. For the US Department of Agriculture, there's legislation to use science that would guide sort of the power of forests and grasslands, wetlands, coastal ecosystems to help capture and store carbon and build the resilience of coastlines. For the Department of Commerce, there's legislation that would support coastal states that have developed their own climate change adaptation plans, but don't have the resources to implement them. And so this legislation would work with the states, provide funding, some technical assistance, as well as training for states to be able to implement those adaptation plans. For the Department of Homeland Security and FEMA, there's legislation that would stand up a pilot program that would give grants to local governments that are enhancing the mapping of flood risks in communities and then providing that information transparently to communities, business owners, and the like. And then one of the other provisions is a Department of Treasury bill for the Internal Revenue Service, which would provide a tax credit to residential taxpayers, commercial building taxpayers who are building in disaster-prone areas, but are doing so in ways that are designed to meet certain resilience criteria. So for many of the bills that we looked at, one of the things now that President Biden has been sworn in that we're seeing a lot about is infrastructure. So really making some serious investments in our roads and bridges and the like. And so as the president's working on that with Congress, EDF is certainly going to be working there as well to ensure that a lot of the relevant pieces of resilience will make it into any such package. Just to underscore that resilience across America really is a framework for us, and the bills that we identified for this exercise are not the end all be all. New challenges are presented all the time, and EDF is always a willing partner with Congress in developing additional resilience proposals. Folks who have been sort of captivated by all of the events from yesterday with the swearing in of a new administration, you've likely been seeing that then President-elect Biden identified his 4 priorities for coming into office, and those included the COVID-19 pandemic, getting that under control, opening up the United States and schools and businesses. Economic recovery is a second priority, racial equity, a third, and then climate change. So I do think, for everyone coming to this webinar today, there's going to be a lot of opportunity to talk about climate change, and hopefully we'll actually be able to do something. The president is certainly surrounding himself with a team solely focused on climate. We saw that former Senator, former Secretary of State John Kerry has been appointed international envoy on climate, sitting with the National Security Council. Gina McCarthy, who I worked with at the US Environmental Protection Agency, is the National Climate Advisor. David Hayes, who some might recognize his name, he was a Deputy Secretary at Interior under both President Clinton as well as President Obama. Most recently had stood up State Energy and Environmental Impact Center at the New York University School of Law. He's coming in as a special assistant to the president on climate. So you're bringing in a lot of really smart people on climate. And so I think that the president clearly is intending to make some headway. it's not just the people that the president's bringing in, but folks may have seen as well that one of his early actions yesterday was to indicate that the United States would join the vast amount of other nations around the globe in signing on to the principles of the Paris Accord. So, one of the things that is often said about President Biden is that he's a creature of the Senate. He has some very deep relationships with members of Congress of both parties. And so I really do think that there is a critical opportunity to see some real activity around climate, and particularly resilience. I want to get to your questions, but my work also involves states. And so just a brief word about what some of the states are doing, and particularly since I was looking at the CJM website, and a number of the states where you have partners are places where EDF is working on resilience. You've got an Arizona partner, and there we've got people on the ground out of Phoenix working on the Colorado River Basin. The 7 states that make up the Colorado River Basin have been working really tirelessly together, again, dealing with issues of drought primarily in the West, and just all of the uses for the water among agriculture, cities, and the like. So we're doing work in Arizona, work in Florida, in North Carolina. I was talking to Avery earlier. We actually have an office in Raleigh. Louisiana is really where our coastal resilience program was born, and we've been doing work there for well over a decade. And then Virginia, Mr. McEachin's, excuse me, home state. So want to talk about states because they're so important. For the last 4 years, really haven't had a partner with the federal government. And so we've seen actually, there's been some really truly extraordinary steps that states have been taking to deal with climate. One of the more recent ones, the Commonwealth of Virginia, actually entered into the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative program. And for the folks who may not be familiar with that, it's a cap and trade program started with Northeast states. Slowly more states are coming into it, Virginia being the most recent. And the nice thing about the tie with reducing greenhouse gases and investing in climate resilience is that Virginia intends to use 45% of the RGGI auction proceeds to finance resilience, and 25% of that 45% is particularly targeted towards disadvantaged communities, EJ communities, and the like. The other just quick state mention in New York, last year, Governor Cuomo had proposed a $3 billion bond act, Restore Mother Nature Bond Act, which would finance a lot of resilient activities. Unfortunately, given COVID, the governor decided the Bond Act passed the legislature, but it was due to go to the voters in New York during the November election cycle. Because of COVID, economic concerns, the governor did not put it on the ballot, but we continue to work with the governor's office and legislature there to ultimately get that back on the ballot so that we can finance coastal resilience work. And with the Bond Act, 35% of that $3 billion would go towards environmental justice communities. So I talked a lot, I apologize. Anxious to hear some of your questions. But I do think, for all of you who are looking at opportunities to engage with your leaders, I do think that the opportunity to pass bipartisan resilience legislation is going to be really quite high. I'm always a hopeful person, but you think too about the very small margins that separate the parties. In the House, the margin of Democrats to Republicans shrank after November, after the special election in Georgia. You all are obviously aware of the 50-50 tie in the Senate. The tie is being broken by the vice president. Just given the slim margins, it really sort of begs for bipartisanship. And I really do hope that we are able to see that. So thank you for your patience through that. But Avery, really anxious to hear what folks are thinking about.
Great. Thanks so much, Mark. That was an incredibly informative presentation. I was quickly making notes here because I learned so much there. I just want to name something before we move over to questions, which is what I'm hearing is just really a cross-agency, cross-sectoral approach to resilience that addresses many scales of government. And that really gets to the heart of the definition of resilience that we've been probing through this program, which is that resilience isn't just one thing, but it's a lot of different pieces working together in tandem. And that's obviously reflected in the policy realm as well, that there's not one single silver bullet of resilience, because it's such a local issue that there need to be cross-sectoral and interdisciplinary approaches.
It's very well said.
So one question that I have, and this comes from Creation Justice Ministries' real emphasis on oceans. We've been doing a lot of work on oceans and marine action, and really kind of thinking about how ocean action and resilience action can be aligned. So I'll just ask you, how does ocean climate action play into ensuring we have resilient coasts? Similarly, what kinds of policies might support both resilient coasts and caring for our oceans?
Yeah, I think it's a really ripe environment. They're actually, and they're listed in our, it's a bill that's listed in our framework, a blue carbon bill, bipartisan again, certainly in the House, and then in the Senate. Senator Murkowski, Republican from Alaska, together with Senator Whitehouse from Rhode Island, introduced this bill. But really looking at not only how you use sort of the coastal ecosystems to sort of pull carbon out of the air, but then you're also building up the resilience to sea level rise, increased wave activity. You know, there's a lot of, and tribal nations actually coming from Washington State are quite successful in developing oyster beds to help deal with some of that wave action. There's a lot of science yet that we still have to actually figure out. And, you know, how much does sea kelp and the like, how much carbon do those actually absorb and for how long? So there's a lot, and the legislation gets to those scientific unknowns, working with NOAA and Commerce and the National Academies of Science. But, you know, I think the ocean is this vastness, right, where we still don't really know what goes on in the depths. There are some people who are looking at how it is that, you know, whales that die and how much carbon have they absorbed, and then they carry that with them when they go to the bottom of the ocean and decompose. So a lot of unknowns, but I think there are decidedly some policy frameworks coming together in the Congress to answer those questions.
Great, thanks, Mark. A question that I've seen pop up several times in the chat, which is actually sort of an artifact of that definition of resilience, that interdisciplinary approach, is that it's hard to pinpoint a single entry for advocacy. So what would be your recommendation to the advocates on this call who are not experts on resilience, not experts on policy for the most part, but really want to get involved in resilience efforts?
A lot of this really is, and the congressman was speaking to this about how very localized these issues are. If you are, and you know, we think of the coasts as sort of the places contending with flooding the most, but you look in the Midwest and the riverine communities and all the flooding that went on. I mean, I mentioned the derecho, and that was mostly wind events this past August, but, you know, a few years ago, the Midwest was dealing with some serious flooding issues. And so I think you see a lot of communities sort of developing flood plans. And so, you know, it could be as simple as, you know, your community, and I mentioned some of these bills that are trying to get resources to local communities to do more flood mapping work. But I mean, it could be your own community is looking at flooding issues and how do you become more resilient? You know, in the local environment, schools, you know, and I was talking about sort of the big sort of federal things that the Department of Education could do, but how is it that we are creating schools that can deal with extreme weather events? If you're in an urban area with a lot of heat islands and you've got kids going into schools where air conditioning, is, you're running it all the time. I mean, what sorts of green infrastructure, trees and the like, can you actually be building? So I think there are very localized things. For those of you that have an interest, funding is always going to be a challenge and an issue, which is why I really wanted to highlight the fact that some states are looking at creative ways to finance resilience. And so, encourage you to look at what your state is doing. And then obviously the federal government is where a lot of the big resources can come. And I do think in the near term that we will see an infrastructure package. There's a bill that's highlighted in our framework that would look at the Department of Transportation using more nature-based resources in building resilience in the transportation system, getting more information to states and localities about building resilience. So I really think there are lots of opportunities, which means it can also be incredibly overwhelming. My contact information is on the one pager of the framework. So please reach out, and Avery, if anyone wants to have further conversation, I'm happy to explore those opportunities.
Great. Thanks so much, Mark. From me, and I can imagine from everyone else who's participating, our deepest gratitude for sharing your expertise and your words of encouragement and your words of action for us to go forward. So thank you,
and really look forward to working with you all.
Great. All right, with our remaining time, I just want to share a couple resources for everyone on the call. I know there are a number of questions in the chat about, how can we apply this at a congregational level? How can I go back to my church and talk about resilience? So I'm going to share my screen here real quick just to share one resource that I think will be particularly helpful. And that is the Faithful Resilience Guide from Creation Justice Ministries. You can find this guide at creationjustice.org/resilience, and it organizes resilience around 6 different themes with theological underpinning for each, with sample questions, scriptural readings, and practical next steps that you can take. This is a really good starting point for either a sermon series on resilience, perhaps a Bible study, or if your congregation has a green team, this would be a great resource for them to work through that. And second, I want to invite you all to stay engaged with the Climate Resilience Workshop series. Next month, our workshop is Resil-Lent Worship, because it's the beginning of Lent. And what we'll be asking is, how can we preach our way to climate resilience? So we'll be featuring sermons by folks including Ched Myers and Reverend Melanie Mullen, and we'll be hearing both original and classic music, classic hymns from the musician Christian McEachin. So with that, I want to thank you all for joining today. The recording will be sent out later this week along with these resources that were shared. Thanks everyone. Bless you all.